Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. Should we be satisfied with the vaccination program that's presently underway in the country? Has the time now come to consider boosters for people over the age of 60? And is there a danger that India could experience the worrying surge that Europe is presently living through? Those are the three key issues that I shall raise today with Professor of Virology at the Christian Medical College in Vellore and a member of the government's COVID working group, Gagandeep Kang. Professor Kang, as of today, 82% of India's adults have received a single jab, and pretty close to 44% have received two jabs. But it's also now almost crystal clear that India is not going to meet its target of fully vaccinating every adult before the end of the year. How serious a concern is that?
I'm not particularly worried if we don't reach every adult with 2 doses before the end of the year. But what we do need to have a laser focus on is making sure that we reach older adults with 2 doses as soon as possible. And what worries me is that we've been focused very much on the overall numbers and the overall coverage. And we are not breaking it down by the people that are most vulnerable and most at risk, which is the elderly and those with comorbidities. We need to have the highest level of coverage in them. And as far as I can see, what we are doing is actually achieving similar levels of coverage across all age groups. And that's not the way it should be.
Let me take up on that particular point you make. I was speaking yesterday to Professor Rijo John, who says that within the figure of 12 crore cited by the health minister a few days ago who haven't so far come on time for their second jab, there's a very worryingly large percentage of people over 60 in that 12 crore. He says 45% of people over 60 haven't had a second dose. And ironically, the percentage of people between 45 and 59 who haven't had a second dose is also 45%. Now, these are people, particularly those over 60, who are vulnerable because of their age. Are you worried that such a large proportion of the over 60 haven't had a second jab?
Yes, it is very worrying. And it's not just over 60, it's over 60, every age from 45 and up. We should be trying to cover as much as possible because in India, we have a lot of comorbidities in people over 45. So the fact that the elderly, as well as the ones that are relatively young but likely to have comorbidities, have not been covered is worrying. And this is exactly what we need to be focusing on. When it comes to thinking about the decline of protection, even among those people who have received 2 doses, these are the groups that will ultimately be, again, the most vulnerable and should be prioritized. So if we can't get to them with 2 doses, can you imagine what will happen when we think about boosters? Because these are the groups we will need to reach first with boosters.
Let me come to boosters in a moment's time, but concentrate on the fact that vulnerable people over the age of 45 and particularly elderly people over the age of 60 have not had second jabs in anywhere near sufficient numbers. You're a member of the COVID working group. I imagine you brought this up in the group many times. What do they say when you suggest, and this is a point you made a moment ago to me, that instead of concentrating on making sure all age groups have an equal number of vaccines, we should focus particularly on those over 45 and even more so over 60. What does the working group say when you raise this point?
The working group is a group that makes recommendations. The execution is in the hands of the government. So we do recommend over and over again that this is the priority list and we must help to get those numbers up in every which way possible.
But this is very interesting. Your words are the working group has recommended over and over again that this is the priority group. Is the government ignoring your recommendations?
Well, as I said, both the COVID working group and the NTAGI are advisory bodies. They make recommendations. The execution is in the hands of the government, and I'm sure the government does the best it can. There is feedback that comes on occasion, and whenever there is feedback that describes what is happening, the working group and the NTAGI recommend once again that the focus needs to be on increasing coverage in the most vulnerable groups.
This is a very interesting and carefully modulated answer you gave me. Both the working group and NTAGI are advisory bodies. Execution is in the hands of the government. And you said, I'm sure the government does the best it can. Clearly, if 45% of people over 60 and also 45% of people between 45 and 59 haven't had a second dose, then the best the government can do is not good enough. I know it's going to be embarrassing to put that to you, but I'm simply saying that is the clear conclusion from what you've said. The government does the best it can, but the best clearly isn't good enough.
Well, I think we need to remember that this is the very first adult immunization program that has been implemented at this scale. Even if we look at routine immunization, the maximum that we have managed to reach, according to official figures, in any year is about 90% coverage, which was achieved at the end of 2019. Now, that is for children in the first year of life, where we do have a focus on vital registration and strong MCH programs that have been built over decades to follow those children up. We don't have any similar program that identifies or targets adults.
Okay.
So we are building this as we vaccinate.
Absolutely. I'll take that as either an explanation or an excuse. The audience can judge for themselves. The government's best may not be good enough, but then remember, this is the first time at this scale we're attempting adult immunization. Hopefully, that is an explanation that will convince someone, but maybe it may not convince everyone. One last question on vaccination before I move on. Would you say that because the second wave left behind very high levels of seropositivity nationwide, just about short of 68%, and because by the time we get to the end of the year, perhaps as many as 90% of adults would have had one jab, that at that point we will be reasonably well protected? Or is that being optimistic?
I think that is somewhat optimistic. We are in a fortunate situation right now where we have very low numbers of cases. So the immunity that is being acquired through infection in the latter half of the year has been much less than was acquired in the first half of the year. Now, if we reach 90%, which is with one infection or one dose of vaccine, then that is not the same as having had 2 doses of vaccine. So there are people who are infected who are unvaccinated, and there are people who are uninfected who have received only 1 dose. So a single exposure. We know that for the Delta variant, which is what is predominant the world over at the moment, that 1 exposure is not necessarily sufficient, and the more exposures you get, the better your protection gets. So I don't think we could afford to be complacent with 90% single exposures.
Okay, that's very clear. Let me put 1 or 2 more concerns about the government's inability to reach out to everyone before I come to boosters. I'm talking, first of all, about a very large number of people in rural India who've come for their first jab but haven't returned for the second. Anurag Behar, the CEO of the Azim Premji Foundation, whose organization does a lot of work with rural vaccination centers, says that one of the key problems in reaching out to these people and motivating them for a second jab is that the system has only recorded their mobile numbers and not their addresses. And in rural India, connectivity is often very poor. And secondly, at harvest time, farmers are reluctant to pick up their phone, they're concentrating on their fields. Therefore, reaching out to these people has become a major problem. Do you believe the government's Har Ghar Dastak campaign is the right response? Or does something more need to be done?
I think this approach of getting to a geographic area and trying to cover as many people in that area who have been so far unvaccinated or singly vaccinated is the right way to go, because we have very few other options. You have to get the needle into arms. And if you need to find those arms, you need to be where they are. And the Ghar Ghar Dastak approach is one way to do that. If people don't come to the vaccine, you take the vaccine to them.
Another thing suggested by the health minister, although I should add, after suggesting it, he doesn't seem to have done too much more about it, is that he will set up vaccination centers at railway stations and bus stops to implement what he called, perhaps jocularly, a Roko and Toko campaign. What do you think of that?
This is an approach that is borrowed from what we've done with polio, which is to take locations where you might find children under the age of 5 and make sure that they got vaccinated when we had the national immunization days. It is an effective way of ensuring that if you're trying to reach a lot of people, you don't miss too many people. But remember that that is something where you wanted to immunize all under 5s on 2 days in the year. When you try this approach over a longer period of time, I'd like to see modeling that includes the mobility of rural populations to try and figure out how effective such an approach would be.
Absolutely. A lot depends upon the mobility of rural populations and whether the people you want to reach are actually at bus stations and railway stations. Now, let me come to another sort of problem the vaccination program is facing. And this is to do with vaccine coverage, both single and double dose in this instance, in some states where it's way below the national average. I'm talking of Puducherry, Nagaland, Meghalaya, Manipur. How worrying is it that the vaccination coverage for both doses is way below the national average in these states? And then what should we do about it?
Well, obviously, we should try and push up the second dose coverage in those districts. And the important thing to remember that with most public health programs, what is really required is an understanding of who the people are who are unreached and what are the best ways to approach them to build trust in a vaccination program. So what you really need is very local engagement so that you can identify the unreached and reach them with vaccines.
I mean, I imagine that in states like Nagaland, where the first dose coverage is just 49%, or Manipur, where it's just 54%, there's a certain element of vaccine hesitancy that's stopping people coming forward, because the national average for first dose is now 82. So they're way below. How do we tackle vaccine hesitancy? Because clearly there is something cultural or something personal that's inhibiting these people. Do we therefore need a special approach to them?
Oh, absolutely. So all communication strategies for remote populations, for populations that show signs that they are unwilling to take up public health interventions, have to be around building trust in what you are proposing to do. And that requires a deep level of local engagement, of connecting with civil society organizations, of connecting with community leaders, religious leaders, teachers, youth organizations, sports groups, and talking to them about why vaccines are important and working with them in order to reach these populations. It has to be built in partnership with people and organizations that communities trust. There is no other way to do it.
One other question, and then I'll come to boosters. Should we, in these circumstances, consider reducing the gap between doses of Covishield? I ask because pretty close to 90% of the jabs given in India are Covishield. But at the moment, the gap between two doses is 12 to 16 weeks. Should we reduce it to 8, which is what Britain did several months ago?
Britain reduced its gap to 8 weeks because they wanted to reach their elderly population and make sure that they got protected in time. And then they were using Covishield largely in their older population. I don't think reducing the gap makes sense from an immunological perspective. Right now, we are not in a situation where we have a high level of virus circulation that would want us to implement a policy that gives us the incremental advantage of a second dose. The reason for the longer gap is to make sure that you get the most durable immune response possible. Now, if reducing the gap results in better coverage, then it's a trade-off that you make with the possibility of a longer lasting immune response. And if we were to show that reducing the gap made a difference to second dose coverage, I wouldn't have a problem with that. But we haven't shown that a reduction from 12 to 16 weeks to 8 weeks would result in an increase in coverage.
Okay, that's very clear. You believe that we haven't shown that reducing the gap would increase coverage, and therefore, immunologically, it makes sense in the present circumstances to stick with the bigger gap. Let's then, at this point, come to boosters. And I imagine there are a lot of people watching this interview over 60 who are particularly keen on this particular issue. Now, just a couple of days ago, Balram Bhargav, the head of the Indian Council for Medical Research, he's the Director General, said, and I'm quoting him, "There is no scientific evidence so far to support the need for a booster vaccine." On the other hand, studies by Public Health England clearly show that in the UK, for people over 60, there is a 15% decline in protection from hospitalization 6 months or so after the vaccine was given. It comes down from 95% to 80%. Now in India, 8 months have passed since vaccination for the over 60s began on the 1st of March. For many people, they will therefore have crossed 6 months since their second dose. Should that group of over 60s be given boosters?
So first, let's look at the data outside the country and then look at what we have within the country. So outside the country, where data are available across a range of vaccines, not just the AstraZeneca or Covishield equivalent vaccines, it's quite clear that protection against hospitalizations and deaths declines with time. Now, should you give a booster dose at 6 months? Should you give it at 8 months? Should you give it at a year? It depends on how much of a decline you are willing to accept. So if you have a vaccine that gives you 95% protection against hospitalization 3 weeks after you got the second dose of the vaccine, and that declines to 80% protection in over 60s after 6 months, is that the point for a booster? Or should you wait till it declines to 70% or wait till it declines to 60%? That is a risk that countries need to identify to say that this is the point where we think boosters should kick in and for these populations. Now, most Western countries have decided that given that they are heading into winter, winter is traditionally a time where they see a lot of respiratory infections, they would like to boost as quickly as possible to get that 80% back up to 90+%. And they are willing to pay for the vaccines to do that. Now let's look at India. And as you pointed out, it is 8 months since people over 60 or healthcare workers who might be considered a priority group got their vaccines. Where are our data showing decline in protection? The only data that we have for effectiveness, real world performance of vaccines comes from small studies for Covishield and then the recently published study on Covaxin that shows about 50% protection against symptomatic infection during a time when Delta was circulating. Right? All of these studies are small. They are based on thousands of individuals. And in the case of the studies on police personnel, the one from Tamil Nadu was published, that's on about 1 lakh people. We've given out over 1 billion doses of vaccine. We have not looked, unlike the UK, unlike the US, unlike most other countries, we have not looked at millions of people that have received vaccines. We've looked at thousands or tens of thousands. And because our data sets are so small and are focused largely on occupational groups, which are younger than the populations that we are really interested in seeing, and because we are not looking at hospitalizations at all in the big numbers that we look at, we actually have no idea whether protection is declining with time. We have no data. So it's absolutely correct that there is no evidence to show that there is a decline in protection with time. But that may be because there is no evidence, there is no data to be able to do that analysis either.
I'm going to quote what you said because I think it's so striking, actually so worrying, it needs to be reiterated for the audience. Your words were, we have no evidence whether protection is declining with time. And you added, we have no data. We've given over 1 billion to people vaccines. And we have no idea whether hospitalization of those people has increased or whether it's declining. This is very worrying. This is data that should have been collected. When you say we have no data, are you actually saying the government doesn't have it? Or are you saying the government hasn't made it public?
Well, I'm assuming the government has it because we have data that is recorded every time that a person is tested for SARS-CoV-2. And that data requires information on vaccination. And to my understanding, that data is actually used for plotting deaths. So if you look at the Ministry of Health website, there is a vaccine tracker data that indicates that vaccines are protecting against death. It does not break down the data by age. It does not break down the data by location. It does not break down the data by vaccine, at least not the last time I checked. It does tell you that vaccines are working in preventing deaths. We have no data that I am aware of on hospitalizations. And one thing that does worry me is the data that the data journalist Rukmini in Chennai has been looking at that seems to indicate that SARS-CoV-2 deaths in the elderly might be going up. And to me, that has, there may be a lot of confounders there, but it is a worrying signal. And that's the reason why I think it's very important that we start to be able to look at hospitalizations. The data exists.
I'll come to Rukmani's data in a moment's time because I think it's very important. In a very credible sense, it could corroborate the UK finding. But before I come to Rukmani, I just want to repeat again something you said. We have no data on hospitalization, which means we do not know whether hospitalization for COVID of people over 60 has increased 6 months after they were vaccinated. And therefore, we don't know whether protection against hospitalization given by vaccines is declining. This is information that we should have. We could have got it if we'd made the effort of putting it down, but clearly we didn't.
So, as far as I'm aware, I have not seen data. As I mentioned, there are small studies in thousands of individuals or that are being published, and those come mostly from hospitals, the police, and the armed forces.
Could it be,
So,
Professor Kang, that even though
hmm.
you're a member of the COVID working group and one of the most, if not the most eminent virologists in this country, that it's been withheld from you? Because if it exists, you're the one person the government should be sharing it with. So either it doesn't exist, and that would be dreadful because it means the government is simply not doing what it should be doing. But if it does exist and they're withholding it from you, that's inexplicable. I can't think of anything else.
Well, I think one way of thinking about it is that the COVID working group and the NTAGI make recommendations for vaccines. But in terms of looking at the actual implementation, the execution, and the policy, there are other committees that are responsible. Okay. And I assume that those committees have access to these data. Because certainly, where I'm concerned, I would love to be able to see hospitalization data.
Absolutely. But the bottom line before I move to Rukmini is this. We don't know for sure whether the data exists. If it does exist, it hasn't been made available to you. Possibly it's been made available to other committees and other people, but that even we don't know. And this is a very strange situation, and I think it's one the government should clarify immediately. But let's come to Rukmini's data, because she's done excellent work on excess deaths. And recently she's published a paper that shows that in Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and Mumbai, where the age of people who've died of COVID is known, there has been a small uptick in people over 60 dying. And recently, the Times of India on the 22nd has published specifically data from the Bombay Municipal Corporation. And it shows that whereas people over 60 constituted 84% of deaths in February and 80% in March, it dipped to 60% in May and 56% in June. But by September, it was back up to 79%, in October to 80%. This corroborates Rukmini's findings. Rukmini said to me very clearly, her findings are initial. They need further study. They need verification. But what the Times of India published on the 22nd corroborates what she's saying. Do you think this, in a sense, corroborates what the UK found, that after 6 months, protection against hospitalization dips?
Well, I think one of the things that's really important to remember is that when you look at deaths, you can't look at deaths in isolation. You need to know vaccination status, you need to understand comorbidities. And when you see signals or patterns like this, it is a point where you start doing deeper investigations. I would not take these data in isolation as meaning that vaccines are failing. I would like to do a deeper dive into each of the cases and also to look at hospitalizations, because deaths are the peak of the pyramid of morbidity.
As we discussed, to our horror, data on hospitalizations is not available to you. Who knows whether it exists with the government? It's certainly being kept almost as if it was golden Fort Knox. But Rukmini tells me that there is, in addition to the problem you've pointed out, no public data on the vaccination status of COVID-19 deceased. If that data exists, she says it's not public. We don't even know whether it exists or not, but it's certainly not public. Again, isn't that strange? No data on the vaccination status of COVID deceased.
This is a serious issue, and I disagree with Rukmini there, because as I pointed out, the vaccine tracker that is on the Ministry of Health website, that's not updated in real time, does show deaths by vaccination status, single dose or 2 doses, not telling you ages, locations, or which vaccine. So there are data, and it is available.
I'm happy to be corrected. As I said, I was referring to what Rukmini said to me, and I will certainly, in a conversation with her, pass out this information that the vaccine tracker does track the vaccine status of COVID deceased, although, as you added, it doesn't necessarily do it in real time. So there may be a lag between the information the tracker is providing and the actual status on the ground. But nonetheless, despite that lag, the evidence is available, the data is available. We're coming to the end of this interview.
No, I'm sorry. The outputs of the data are available. The data are not available.
That's very interesting. Only the outputs are available. Thank you. Why is the data itself not available? It's not a secret, is it?
I have no idea. I think I would refer you to the Ministry of Health for that.
Absolutely. And as I said, this is another example of what I call gold at Fort Knox. That sort of syndrome seems to pervade data the government possesses, as if this was something to be kept only for the government, not shared with the people, although the data is ours. It's our data, our vaccination status. We can't have it, but the government's keeping it if the government has it. As I said, we're coming to the end of this interview. The second issue is, when and if India does decide to give boosters, what should the vaccination be? In Britain, where AstraZeneca was widely given for the first jab and the second jab, it's deliberately not being given for boosters. The boosters are only Pfizer. So what vaccine should India choose when it decides to give boosters?
I think the timing of boosters is something for us to consider. Which vaccine we use for boosters is something for us to consider. What is very clear from the rest of the world is that boosters will be required for the elderly and those with comorbidities. The priority groups we started with originally, they are the people in whom the vaccines fail the most, all vaccines, and they are the ones that are likely to require boosters. Now, which vaccine should we use for boosters is a very important question. If we base this on antibody data, it's very clear that the mRNA vaccines and the protein vaccines are likely to be the ones that we should be using for boosters if the goal is to get antibodies back up and then show that the antibodies correlate with real world effectiveness. So in India, that leaves us with a situation where Covovax may be a vaccine that we would like to consider because the vaccine gives really high neutralizing antibody responses. And maybe Corbevax, which is the vaccine that is being made by BioE, should be considered as a booster if we have to stay with vaccines that are manufactured only in the country. Genova's mRNA vaccine is still in development, and that may be another vaccine that we could want to consider if it's shown to be successful in phase 3 efficacy trials. So these are options if we stay with vaccines in India. Personally, I think we should be doing everything we can to open up imports and bring in different vaccines on different platforms into the country, because those vaccines are available to the rest of the world. And we have a population that needs those vaccines immediately. And here I'm referring to people who are immunocompromised for one reason or the other, in whom it has not been possible for them to make an adequate immune response with the 2 doses of vaccine that they have received so far. So for them at least, if nothing else, we should, ahead of India making vaccines on different platforms, permit import of vaccines that are available to immunocompromised populations in other parts of the world.
And vaccines that are best for immunocompromised populations are Pfizer and Moderna, the mRNA vaccines? Is that what you're also saying, even though you haven't taken their names specifically?
The studies that have been done have shown that a 3rd dose of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines does result in, not all, but a substantial proportion of immunocompromised individuals seroconverting when they did not seroconvert with the first 2 doses of vaccine. So it would be great to have those vaccines, but I think for many immunocompromised individuals, they are going to require careful immune monitoring to understand whether they have responded or whether they continue to be vulnerable. I'm not a proponent of antibody testing ordinarily, but I think for immunocompromised individuals, this is certainly something we should be considering.
Can I put this to you? You made it absolutely crystal clear for people who are immunocompromised. It would be best, it would be ideal. In fact, as you said, it would be immediately necessary to import these vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna. Are Pfizer and Moderna also the best vaccines for giving booster jabs to people over 60? I ask only because in England, they've deliberately chosen to give boosters with Pfizer and only Pfizer, even to people whose first 2 jabs were AstraZeneca, which is Covishield. That clearly suggests the British think the combination, the mix and match from AstraZeneca to Pfizer is the best one. Should we therefore also get in Pfizer or Moderna as boosters for people over 60?
So the COMCOV study showed that if you mixed a viral vector vaccine with an mRNA vaccine, you got a stronger immune response than if you did only the viral vector vaccine. So this is based on immunogenicity data, and neutralizing antibodies, it is evident that they do correlate. We don't have a cutoff, but they do correlate with the performance of the vaccine. So based on immune...
I'll put that in for layman's language for the audience. The studies you're citing have clearly shown that as boosters, the best booster is Pfizer or Moderna, an mRNA vaccine. It gives a higher level of protection. And therefore, if the Indian...
No, it gives a higher level of antibody response.
Higher level of antibody response. And if the Indian government wants the best for Indian people over 60, it would be well advised to import mRNA vaccines, that's Pfizer and Moderna, and use them as boosters for this population, because that would be better in terms of antibody response than giving this age group a 3rd Covishield jab.
I think what we need to do is actually to generate the data. And the reason that I say that is that Indian populations are not exactly equivalent to the UK population, because the UK population was exposed to the Delta variant, which is where the performance of the vaccine has come from after the bulk of their population was vaccinated. India is very different.
Absolutely. Our second wave was Delta. They're probably going through that at the moment now, which is why they and the rest of Europe are having horrible surges. But nonetheless, the point you made remains. Studies show that the best antibody response comes if you give an mRNA as a booster. And if that is the intention of the government to give the best to people over 60, an mRNA booster would be better than a Covishield one.
I will push back again and say that we actually don't know what happens if you have a Delta infection followed by 2 doses of Covishield or Covaxin. And then if you give a booster, what your immune responses would be. We are looking at data from other parts of the world, but the rest of the world did not have the pattern of infection and vaccination we had. So I don't think it is as crystal clear as you make it out to be.
I was only interpreting what I understood from you. But the other point is, if we need the data to be sure, that's data we should have, because we've given over 1 billion jabs. And clearly, we either don't have that data, or again, it's not being made available to people like you. Isn't that again?
No, that's not quite the case. These are research studies, and a group that I work with is actually looking at a study that is studying booster doses. And we expect to have the data probably sometime in January, but only using the vaccines that are available in the country. Now, if we need to prepare for booster doses, what we need to be doing is to be doing the studies that will give us information when decisions need to be made. And if we don't have access to all the vaccines on all the various platforms, then we can't say what combination is best.
Absolutely. We'll only have half the data. We'll only know the impact of using AstraZeneca as boosters rather than the impact of using mRNA on an Indian situation. I understand we'll have half the data, not the full data. Finally, Professor Kang, my last question, but it is one that many people worry about. At the moment, Europe is going through a very worrying surge. Germany is growing at 55, 56,000 a day, the highest rate of growth that country has ever experienced. Austria has declared a nationwide lockdown. Countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, Slovakia, Hungary have enhanced restrictions. Is there a danger that something similar, another wave like this, could hit India? Many people say that what happens in Europe tends to happen in India 2 months later. Could history repeat itself?
I think the important thing to remember is that what we are dealing with now is the Delta variant. And it is one that is hugely more infectious than anything we saw in the previous year. And in India, we've been through Delta once, but it doesn't mean that Delta could not come back if we had sufficient numbers of susceptible individuals. And susceptible individuals could be those who have been previously completely unexposed, or those who have been exposed or vaccinated and their immunity to infection has waned. Now, this may result in a lot of people getting infected, not necessarily the same proportions going into hospital as we saw during the second wave, but numbers could climb. And it's a reason why continuing to do the interventions that we have been doing, like masking, which prevents transmission, like preventing crowding in public spaces, will continue to be important until our vaccination numbers are above 90. And that's not going to happen without vaccinating children as well. And we are nowhere close to that at this time.
So in a nutshell, despite the fact we ended up with 68% nationwide seropositivity after that massive second wave, and despite the fact the government feels reasonably comfortable with the single jabs reaching 82, 83, and they may reach even 90% by the end of the year. Despite all of that, you're not ruling out the possibility of a European experience happening in India. We need to be careful. We need to keep wearing masks. We need to maintain social distance, because we just don't know how large is the susceptible proportion of the population.
Well, we do know that it's less than we had at the start of the second wave, which is why I don't think that we will see a second wave again without a new variant. But it's not like this is a benign infection, even as breakthroughs, and we do need to continue to be careful.
That's very clear, and I think that's very good advice. We need to continue to be careful. Thank you very much for this interview, Professor Kang. Thank you very much in particular for drawing our attention to your concern about the fact that a very large proportion of people over the age of 60 and even between 45 and 59 haven't had their second jab. That's a 45% proportion, and the government should concentrate on giving it to them rather than ensuring that other age groups have an equal number of jabs, because these are people because of age or comorbidities who are vulnerable. Thank you also for drawing our attention to the fact that we're not sure whether critical data about hospitalization and about the relationship between vaccination and hospitalization is available. If it is, it's certainly not public. You haven't seen it. Why is the government keeping it to itself? Those are questions that are important. I'm grateful you've raised them. Take care. Stay safe.